Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'll be continuing my series of reading, comparing, and examining the two different texts of each book in the original Hardy Boys series canon. Now, for those unaware, or for people who haven't seen my videos in this series so far, the first 38 books of the original iconic Hardy Boys series, starting in 1959, were rewritten over an extended multi-year period by the Stratemeyer Syndicate, and this was done by a variety of different authors. The idea was to quietly bring all of the books going all the way back to the original Tower Treasure in 1927, Book 1, to try and bring them up to the present, starting in 1959, to try and modernize certain elements that were dated, which is somewhat understandable because, of course, these were now books dating back to the 1920s in the earliest volumes, but also to remove dated aspects, most especially some elements of racial stereotyping that crept into the books. And while that was a very great ideal, it was not necessarily the cause for doing this process as most people think it was. If you were even aware of this, that's usually what you hear about. But it was also a means of streamlining the books and also shortening them significantly, as most of the original text would be 200 pages or more, and then the revised texts were on average anywhere between only 160 to 170 some odd pages. So this was a means of actually making the books cheaper to manufacture and getting them to the same size and standard as the other books that were still ongoing. So after this process was complete, you had the eventual canon of 58 books in the original series before things changed publishing hands, and these are the books that are still retained under the same publishing house and imprint, and they're viewed as the original series canon, plus the Detective Handbook, which itself was given a revised text. But for the first 38 books, you have to look at the original text editions by the original ghostwriters, and then the revised texts that were done, again, over an extended period of time, and they were done out of order, so they weren't even done consecutively. Each of the books is also done in a different standard of revision. Some are very close to their originals. Some take the original plot and turn it into a subplot joined with a new main plot. Some add a variety of subplots, and then some drop the original plot entirely, and really, outside of a few bits of iconography and character names, the only thing it has in common with the original text is the title. And again, this was done without any fanfare or acknowledgement, and so before the internet, when us fans could talk with one another, you would basically stumble across a book you had already read as a kid, and suddenly not only would it have different cover art, but it would be an entirely different text inside, sometimes very close to what you had remembered and sometimes entirely different, and then usually significantly longer as well. And this didn't just happen to the Hardy Boys, it also happened to Nancy Drew at the same time and in the same manner. So you have to look at the original Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew series and also go back and look at their original text editions for all the books pre-1959. And again, the same sort of thing happened. In the revision process, some things were, of course, lost. The greatest sort of casualty was the sense of texture and world building that was in the original text, plus having a grittier, more pulpy style to them. And usually the elements of danger are much more felt, in addition to the original text almost always having a far greater degree of resiliency for our boy heroes, and also a wonderful sense of humor. The revised texts are much more action-focused, and the pacing is greatly increased because, again, you lose about 30 to 40 pages or more in terms of page count per book. So really the only way you can study them and understand the revisions that were done is to read each text back to back, and that's what I'm doing in this series. So in this video, we're looking at Book 20 in the original series, The Mystery of the Flying Express, or the revised text version just drops "the" from the title and turns it into Mystery of the Flying Express. The original text was released in 1941 and was ghostwritten by John Button, making it part of his era of the series, which is generally regarded by most fans as sort of the low point. And this, of course, is coming after the most notorious book, the absolutely bonkers Book 19, The Disappearing Floor, in its original text, which is the most out there and off-the-rails Hardy Boys book in the entire original canon. Some people absolutely hate it, so much so that they refuse to even acknowledge it as a Hardy Boys book. This book, unfortunately, in its original text, text sort of has some of the same traits, and like the other Button books, it's not the best written and most engaging of the original series, but it doesn't get quite as bonkers as the original text of Disappearing Floor, so it is a bit of a relief if you didn't enjoy that book. The revised text was written by Vincent Burinelli and didn't come out until 1970, so it's one of the later revisions and has all of the flavor, style, pacing, and even sort of cover art design as we saw in all the other books of the series that were coming out in the early 1970s. So it really feels like a different era of the books because it technically was. So it's a good example of how, because the revisions were done completely out of order and staggered over many years, that you can pick up a revised text from 1959 or 1962 or somewhere around there, and then you can pick up a revised text from 1970 or so, and you'll notice that there's a difference, even though it's technically a book that should be very similar to other numbered books around that in the series. It's just because different writers were assigned different books to revise over an extended period of time. Now, to talk about the original text, this one is like Disappearing Floor. It's very hard to actually discuss the plot because the book is very episodic. There is quite a bit of backtracking. The writing style isn't as engaging, and it's also very nonsensical. One gets the idea of what the sort of plot setup is, but then the book sort of forgets about that for extended periods of time and then only sporadically seems to remember what it's supposed to be about. But it's also, being in 1941, this is technically getting into the wartime era in terms of World War II and the overall theme of the Hardy Boys trying to stop a foreign spy gang of potential saboteurs with a secret sort of training camp hidden somewhere in the United States. It's a fascinating concept, and honestly, it has the makings of a great pulpy adventure, or one could even picture this as a great setup for one of the classic Republic cliffhanger action serials. So it fits perfectly for a 1941 setting and seems like it would be really interesting to have the Hardy Boys get involved with this and sort of be working a different aspect of a case that their father, Fenton Hardy, is working on for the federal government. So, it's got a lot of topical themes, and it seems like there could be a great deal of action involved. But it's also from the John Button era, and this is the first book after the absolutely insane Disappearing Floor. So unfortunately, it still has some of that insanity and nonsensical qualities to the plot and the writing. And when you're reading this, especially if you're used to the revised text and you haven't read the original text before, you're going to be scratching your head a lot. And unfortunately, there's also, I would say, at least for me, there's maybe just a little bit of, not necessarily boredom that creeps in when you read this, but your mind definitely wanders a little bit because you're not as engaged by the plot. And this is something you have to deal with in Disappearing Floor because it's so weird. But that book is so weird that it does hold your interest a little bit more. There is still plenty of weirdness in Flying Express, but it unfortunately suffers from a lot of the same problems that the books of the John Button era do, that of course started with book 17, The Secret Warning, and would continue on for a little bit longer after Flying Express. So as this plot and overall book reading experience does have some of the same bizarre head-scratching qualities as reading the original text of Disappearing Floor, I once again had to resort to writing down some of the events that happen and some of the just bafflingly insane bits and trying to just come up with a plot summary after the fact is really quite difficult. So I'm just going to go through some of these, and I think these highlight the sort of wonderful wild factor that you always get in the original text, and you certainly get an abundance of in the John Button era of books, but also I think it can convey the rather frustrating experience of reading some of the books in this era of the original text, and how having the revisions made years after the fact, it did help at the very least in having a far more consistent and engaging narrative, but usually at the cost of the world building, and in the John Button era, certainly at the cost of the sheer wildness of the events that happen. So essentially the plot setup is that Frank and Joe Hardy are tasked by their father Fenton Hardy to assist with a case he's working on, and this is a case that Fenton Hardy, who is of course the world's most famous private detective in the series, has been tasked by the federal government to try and catch a gang of foreign spies who are, quote, out to upset our whole social order, end quote. So one can take that to mean a gang of saboteurs, or of course foreign agents in the earlier stages of World War II. So it's a very topical and interesting idea. The boys are told to look out for a camp that the spies are rumored to have somewhere in the United States. And of course this is eventually linked to the titular Flying Express of the title, which of course is an express train that makes a variety of stops going into the Midwest, which in some sections gives the story almost a sense of North by Northwest, which of course would famously come later in 1959. There is a good degree of humor in this book, plus the Hardys using more of their detective skills. Fenton Hardy even pokes fun at his sons by basically having a Sherlock Holmes observation moment of pointing out bits that he has observed with his keen detective powers, and makes fun of his boys for not paying attention and noticing things. Plus, the Hardy Boys do have to use a bit of code-breaking skills and also bits of detective and crime-solving methodology. So this book does feel more fleshed out and more engaging than Disappearing Floor. It doesn't feel as crazy or off the wall, and there is no science fiction gadgetry or anything. But there are also a number of, frankly, a number of errors in naming some characters, and some absolutely nutty things that happen, as in the opening, there is a character who says he's a locksmith there to fix the locks on the Hardy house, and no one questions this. And of course, he does turn out to be a member of the spy gang there to see what Fenton Hardy knows, and even wires Fenton Hardy's office with a dictaphone that has a speaker outside, which is discovered when the Hardy's friend Chet Morton walks up and happens to hear their voices out loud outside. Not necessarily the best method for eavesdropping, and it does make the world's best private detective look like a bit of an idiot when nobody questions the fact that some random guy shows up to repair the locks as a locksmith, and no one even questions this when apparently no one even ordered it in the first place. And not that I'm a big stickler for continuity errors or things, but sometimes they're so jarring that they jump out at you. So in this book, for whatever reason, the Hardy Boys' mother, Laura Hardy, who's not often a major character in the books, for whatever reason, she's identified as Mildred Hardy, so that seems to be a complete goof up. And then the boys fingerprint the dictaphone and take the prints to the local Bayport police station, where they talk to their old friend Chief Finch of the Bayport Police Department, which is kind of surprising given that famously the Hardy Boys always dealt with their longtime friend and associate Chief Colleague of the Bayport Police Department, so that seems like another goof. And of course, in the original text, they had there was definitely a bit of antagonism between the chief of police and the boy detectives. That, of course, was immediately removed for the revised text. Now, the fake locksmith had a particular and very odd manner of speaking, with a distinct accent that the boys couldn't place, and a rather strange manner of having a sort of very halting speech pattern that had these short sentences that just kind of stopped, almost as if they had practiced how they spoke, as if they were learning English through a phrase book. And this actually becomes a recurring theme and subplot throughout the book of how the boys obviously identify members of this spy gang who all, for unknown reasons at the start, speak in this very strange vocal pattern. This gets developed further when the boys randomly go to a restaurant and there's a vocal expert there betting people that he can identify where they're from simply by how they speak. And the boys talk to him and try try to explain this strange speech pattern of this spy that was in their house. And the professor isn't able to help them, but randomly talks about one of the world's foremost voice professors who mysteriously disappeared a number of years before. And this seemingly is out of nowhere, but of course the reader is very much aware that this will somehow coincidentally come into play later in the book, and indeed it does in the climax. And so this is basically a random coincidental occurrence that is used to develop this plot thread that will then not really be resolved until the end of the book. From this point, the book becomes very episodic as the boys see the false locksmith receiving packages and bundles from or being thrown off of the flying express train that goes through Bayport, and in being able to confiscate one of these secret packages, find some bit of code linked to a town somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, and this sort of puts them on the trail of the spy gang and potentially where their secret operations and training base is located to then carry out their nefarious schemes against the United States from the inside. So pretty much the rest of the book until we get to the climax, we have Frank and Joe Hardy and sometimes Chet Morton continually trailing members of the gang in and around Bayport, but also primarily centered around the train station and the Flying Express. It becomes very clear to the boys that the Flying Express is the means of which the gang not only gets to and from the secret headquarters base, but also how they communicate between members, and the boys have to try and crack the code the gang uses in their secret communications. The giveaway for gang members is, of course, all the gang members have the strange, halting sort of speech pattern, which, if it was meant to make them less visible, it doesn't really work. It makes them stick out like a sore thumb, because every time they even go to the train station window to buy a train ticket, they sound like a complete weirdo, and it's extremely obvious anytime the boys run into one of the spy gang, because they immediately open their mouth and give themselves away, even though the idea apparently is that because their voice is so weird when they use this secret speech pattern that it's not identifiable as any particular nationality, but it's very obvious if they use this weird speech pattern, they're one of the spy gang, because who else sounds that weird? Eventually, Joe Hardy is tracking one of the gang members on a plane flight, which is then forced to crash land out in essentially a sort of farmland area, and then he winds up teaming with a local private detective, and they wind up sort of stuck at a very strange farm or ranch house out in the middle of nowhere that seems almost like well, there's nothing really going on in terms of activities, so it becomes very obvious that it seems like some sort of front for other activities. And of course, the people there speak with the strange accent, meaning that they are part of the spy gang. We then leave Joe and this private detective for an extended period of time, essentially on a cliffhanger, and switch back to Frank, who's in a completely different part of the country. And he's, of course, following up different leads, and eventually the book will bring them back together at the moment we were left on a sort of dangerous cliffhanger with Joe and the private detective at the sort of ranch that isn't a ranch. And that's not a device I'm very fond of. It doesn't really fit in a Hardy Boys story, but it would be better if we didn't spend an extended period of time suddenly switching to Frank Hardy and eventually coming back to where we left off Joe Hardy. That's something you can only do with like maybe a chapter of space between, because the reader sort of loses track of where they were. And it's beyond coincidental and honestly a bit frustrating when suddenly somebody shows up at the exact point of danger to save someone else, and the reader was at that point, 20, 30 pages ago. I should also mention that in Frank's investigating, he encounters essentially a sort of stock cowboy character who then agrees to follow him around and is the one who's there to help rescue Joe Hardy and the local private detective he's with. So we have two random side characters that are sort of stock characters in a way that the boys are saddled with, when ideally they should be working together in that strange sort of ranch that isn't a ranch house, and thus not have all this distraction and meandering and 20 pages of other story elements before we suddenly come back to where we were. The boys manage to break the code of the gang and then hatch a scheme to send fake telegrams to try and unearth members of the gang, and then follow the trail on the flying express train, watching the various gang members they uncover to hopefully discover the secret location of the hidden spy encampment. This, of course, doesn't go quite to plan and leads to the moment we see depicted on the original cover of Frank Hardy having to hitch a ride on a motorcycle to try and beat the train to stop Joe Hardy from carrying out their plan of sending the false telegrams. They have to essentially rework it once Frank has discovered additional information, so they're not captured by the gang. Their revised plan doesn't necessarily also work out in the way that they planned, as while they do uncover some of the gang members, then the entire train is wrecked, and then they have to somehow crawl out of the wreckage, then try to follow the one gang member they were watching on the train, and in the midst of, just broken bodies and just people trying to struggle to recover from a complete train wreck, they follow this gang member essentially off into the wilderness and the woods of somewhere in the Midwest, and they get shot at. Frank gets knocked out, and they see a plane drop a package to a strange house or cabin in the middle of the woods. They keep going and stumble across a fence that they have to basically rig a vine ladder to get over. But of course, if that wasn't easy enough, they have to hurry up and get over the fence with this improvised vine ladder because they're attacked by a grizzly bear. Of course, if we had the full logic of disappearing floor, they could have killed it with a rock the way they killed a tiger with the rock in the woods in disappearing floor. But anyway, once they get over this fence, they have indeed discovered the secret spy camp, which has a number of different buildings and facilities. They see through the window of the main hall over 1,000 men gathered together, essentially to get, their sort of training presentation for the night, and break into an area which is actually a gigantic munitions depot filled with all kinds of artillery and ammunition and explosives, essentially to start a small war or provide for endless amounts of sabotage against the United States. Joe, of course, encounters the kindly old Professor Morse, who happens to be the very same language expert professor who mysteriously disappeared on the Flying Express years before, and he, of course, is the one who's been training the spies how to have an accent that can't be detected as any specific language, even though it sticks out like a sore thumb. And of course, he just happens to have no idea he's working for a secret spy organization inside their facility, and that the rest of the world doesn't know what happened to him because he had an indefinite leave of absence. And this fellow said that they wanted to hire him to train people how to speak, and he never considered anything might be wrong. This as he's talking to Joe Hardy inside of a munitions depot. You see the problems in logic here. The boys manage to escape with Professor Morse by the skin of their teeth and get back to the nearest town where the inhabitants, for reasons, believe they caused the train wreck and try to throw them in jail. And the only reason this is avoided is because Frank Hardy pulls out a card with his name on it, and the sheriff goes, "Oh, you're one of the Hardy boys, then it's fine." Later, Fenton Hardy shows up with authorities, and they raid the camp and, of course, have to discover what happened to the spy gang. We then have the sort of unraveling of the final aspects of the mystery that hadn't been sort of cleared up. And this also highlights some of the more strange, out there, ludicrous bits that I haven't mentioned yet. There's one point where there's a phone call from the Hardy house to our heroes, and it gets cut off for some reason, and it is revealed to simply be Aunt Gertrude, the boy's peppery, always opinionated aunt, hitting the client Fenton Hardy over the head and knocking him out. There's also a moment earlier on where the boys go into their own house to look in their father's safe to make sure that papers were still there. And suddenly they're confronted by the police because their aunt thought they were burglars for some reason. When Frank decodes the first gang message about the train times of the Flying Express, he's then caught in a hotel fire as the hotel they're in is set on fire for seemingly random reasons. And if that weren't enough, he barely escapes, then goes back into the burning building to save a baby from upstairs. So there's an entire set piece sequence seemingly out of nowhere. And lastly, it's said that the train crash was caused by the spy gang themselves simply because they had switched the tracks and not thought about it because they had a supply train coming in and they just didn't think about the passenger train that also had some of their agents on it. So whoops, they're bad. Also, if they had trains dropping off supplies seemingly out in the middle of nowhere, you would think that eventually somebody might realize that there's a secret spy encampment of over 1,000 men with a munitions depot just out somewhere in the woods. So ultimately, The Mystery of the Flying Express is a better book, obviously, than the original text of The Disappearing Floor, but it has a lot of the same pitfalls in terms of plot logic not being the greatest and being mostly about backtracking or having very similar actions that get very repetitive. This is really, I think, the biggest issue we see in the John Button era of books, and that's not really the author's fault because he was having to work from the outline that he was being given. It just happens that a lot of the outlines had some similarities at this point in the books. His tenure started on book 17, The Secret Warning, and that's where I think you can feel the real shift. I do think Flying Express has some great set pieces and moments and has the wonderful extra gritty, pulpy flavor of the original text. You feel the danger elements much more, and the levels of tension are usually far greater than the revised text. But it's hard to get invested in this plot because it's just not very engaging and it feels extremely repetitive as the boys continually go to watch the train or follow gang members around using various forms of transportation. Then they go back home, then they go back to the train, then they're following more gang members around. And then you have some of the extreme coincidental moments as we see in the other Button books. So there's a lot of similarities that exist in the books that started with Secret Warning. It is obviously not bonkers like Disappearing Floor was, but it has some bonkers moments and some things that are very frustrating and facepalm inducing for the reader. So it's got a little bit of that, but it doesn't have that same crazy bonkers wildness that Disappearing Floor does. So actually, in some ways, I think when you read this, your mind might wander more than it did on Disappearing Floor. So that's the sort of trade-off. Yes, it's more coherent. It's not going into crazy science fiction territory, but it's not as wild and thus not quite as fun. As crazy as Disappearing Floor was, it kind of was fun to see how crazy it was going to get. So I couldn't say that it's actually better or worse than the original text of Disappearing Floor. I think your mileage is definitely going to vary with the John Button era of the original text books. Different books, I think, will be more passable or more endearing to different readers depending on what you like in the Hardy Boys series, but I think there's a general consensus among all of us fans that this era of the original text is really where you get the most mixed results, shall we say. Now, for the revised text, we turn to 1970's Mystery of the Flying Express. For whatever reason, they dropped the from the title. Now, this is essentially a completely different work, but the sort of signifying theme that still connects it to the original is that you have criminals or a gang being investigated by the Hardys and their father, who are, for whatever reason, centered around or focused on a particular means of public transport that is named the Flying Express. Here in the revised text, it is a new hydrofoil that is being marketed as a new means of public transit that is under threat of being sabotaged sabotaged for various reasons due to there being a misguided sense of public outcry given about it. So the Hardys themselves are contacted by the hydrofoil's owner to try and uncover who might be trying to sabotage the Flying Express, as their father is working on a case for the state police to try and uncover the whereabouts of a gang who is essentially stealing and then stripping small craft and other parts to then sell on the black market. Right off the bat, the revised text is much more focused. It has a faster pace, of course, a significantly shorter page count. We have all the inherent themes and cliches of the revised text as we see in all of them, such as Chet Morton having his particular hobby that will come into the plot repeatedly and then wind up helping to solve the case at the end. Here, of course, it's his interest in astrology, which winds up being shared by the lead villain of the piece, which is the rather wonderfully named Hooks Zagurski, as he is a long-term criminal who lost a hand and now has a rather menacing hook, giving him an almost piratical feel, which is great for a case that revolves around the waterfront. So, of course, it's a much more enjoyable reading experience than the original text, as the revised text is very consistent. It moves at a quicker pace. It has a number of nice set pieces. The actual mystery is well told enough, even though the actual stakes aren't the greatest. The individual moments do have some nice bits of danger, and a number of them are actually a bit more intensive than what you see in a lot of the other revised texts. So I think you can tell this is a later book coming out in 1970 because they are trying to at least up the feeling of tension and danger and suspense as opposed to some of the earlier revised texts. So this is definitely a book that has so little to do with the original text that I think you can consider it a completely different work that merely uses the same title. Even when you read the books back to back, outside of there being some sort of public transit called the Flying Express that's being used by a gang, that's really about all you can say connects the two. But interestingly, the revised text, as well done and solid as it is, it's not a super engaging book in the canon. It's never been one of my favorite books, and it's one that I always remember some of the set pieces, side characters, and unique aspects of, but actually thinking about the mystery and the plot, it doesn't really stick out or remain lodged in your memory all that much. For whatever reason, it's been one of the books in the canon that's never grabbed me as much as a reader. I don't know if that's because it inherited some of the issues of the original text, trying to rework that, or if it's because it's one of the later revised texts coming in at 1970, but it's a solid revised text that I do think is obviously better than the original text because it is much better constructed, and it basically throws out pretty much all of the original text. But the overall result is a book that's it's solid, but it's not ever particularly remarkable outside of some of the set pieces and, again, some of the side characters. I think the biggest thing you might remember is the side character of the artist Henry Chasen, and also some of the gang members, of course, notably Hook Zagurski himself, but also the fact that there's a hydrofoil, the Flying Express, and Chet Morton and his astrology hobby continually being mentioned, much to the delight of the Hardy Boys, because then they have something new to tease their chum with. We also see appearances, of course, from Fenton Hardy, the boy's father, and, of course, his associate Sam Radley, who crops up throughout the revised text. And nicely, there's at least something for the female characters to do in terms of Callie Shaw and Isla Morton, who are the long-term sort of love interests of the Hardy Boys. Usually they sort of pop up in brief flashes throughout the series, but occasionally in the revised text, as we see here in Flying Express, they get to at least get in on the action a little bit or have more of a presence, so that's nice to see because it didn't happen all the time. But ultimately, the revised text is a more satisfying read. It has a number of elements that feel at least a bit more suspense driven than what we're used to in a lot of the revised text. So it's a well done revised text, but it's never been one that has particularly grabbed me as much. So if I were to do, say, a ranking of all the revised texts, it would probably be somewhere in the middle, as usually the stuff I remember is the astrology, the hydrofoil, and then some of the side characters and set pieces, much more so than the actual mystery. But it is a far better constructed, better written book than the original text. But again, you do lose out on that wild flavor of the 1941 original text, because that's from the John Button era, and it's got that wild, pulpy flavor, which, while it might be a bit of a frustrating book to read in terms of its plotting not being very logical, well, sometimes you need a little bit of that spice in a book experience, and I think that's the major trade-off when going from the original to the revised text. But everything else in the revised text is an improvement, and I think was actually necessary. I wish they could have kept the idea of a foreign spy gang with a secret headquarters somewhere in the United States. I love that sort of pulpy plot setup, which again seems ripped right out of a cliffhanger serial. What we do have in the revised text is good for the mystery and the story that's being told, but it's just not as sort of earth-shattering in terms of stakes. But again, the original text doesn't really fulfill that promise of its plot either. So I think the reader's preference will depend on which sort of style they prefer, whether it's a strong or more average original and revised text that you're looking at. I think which Flying Express you prefer will greatly depend on what sort of flavor you like, but it's no secret that the revised text is the better written, better constructed, better plotted book, and every aspect of the revised text is better than the original text, at the cost of losing that wild flavor of the John Button era of the series. Now let's talk about the cover art designs. The first, from the original 1941 edition, was by the artist Paul Lawn, and he did a number of the covers around this era of the series. This depicts the moment where Frank is trying to stop Joe from passing their phony telegram on the Flying Express. He's hitched a ride on a motorcycle. That's, of course, a very bumpy ride, and it's at least a nice little dramatic moment. But of course, in the book, we don't actually get this scene from Frank's perspective, and it's nowhere near as dramatic as how the cover renders it. So it's always been surprising to me why this image was chosen to be the cover image, as I would have chosen probably a different image, or maybe something from the train wreck. The Flying Express in the title, I think, means that you have to have the Flying Express train somewhere on the cover, so I don't think you could get away with using, say, the moment where the boys are in the spy camp or being attacked by a grizzly bear or something. So this is a fitting cover, and at least it's more dramatic than what we get in the book, but if you look at the overall design and composition, it's not very clear exactly what's going on. In fact, it kind of looks more like Frank is riding by on a motorcycle just waving at somebody. You can't even tell that it's Joe Hardy, as he's so off in the distance. But the composition is good. It has a sense of speed. The color is good, even if the style is a bit more in the sort of cartoony realm, and instead of going for more photorealism. But, it fits the era in terms of the train and the motorcycle and the boys' clothing. So it works. It's just never been one of my favorite covers in the series. In 1962, we got another John Leone cover, this in his usual sort of style, with a really ominous figure sort of in the foreground, and the boys in one of the moments from the original text where they're recovering one of the gang packages off the Flying Express that we can see in the background. As usual with the Leone covers, they have a nice striking composition, and we have here the figure obviously looking on ominously in great detail with more realism to the actual art style. But the rest of the image has a bit of a plainness, and also the train no longer looks like the fancy Flying Express train. It's also trying to modernize the overall appearance, as this is a 1962 cover, but the book itself is still the original 1941 text. So it gets points from me for being an event from the book, of having nice composition and having the nice sort of usage of color, especially with the sort of yellow-orange sunset. But everything else does have a little bit of plainness to it, especially since basically the whole top third of the cover is mostly just empty sky and with the title stuck on there. It's a good cover. I also don't think the depiction of the boys themselves is exactly the greatest. They're just not in as much detail because they're not the main focus of the cover, as that is given to the ominous figure of the gang member looking on as the boys steal the sort of shipment. So ultimately, I think this is a good cover. I like elements of it better than the original cover, but also I don't think it's as iconic as the original, as that image was used on the multi-scene end papers in the books for years. So usually this is probably the cover image that people are going to think of least when they think about Flying Express. They'll either think about the original cover or the cover for the revised text. But it's still a very good interim cover, essentially. So of course in 1970, Rudy Nappi, the sort of most iconic artist for the series, did a new cover for the revised text. So the first two covers are very much locked to the original text, and this is, of course, done expressly for the revised text. But since it's a 1970 book, you can very much tell this is in the style of the covers he was doing for the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew at this time. So you've got a very bold standard background here. It's a bold choice to just have a just complete whiteness. And then we have the Flying Express hydrofoil surrounded by the signs of the zodiac in blood red, and then the sea is actually blood red. And then we have the boys themselves as just sort of floating heads, like they're going to be run down by the hydrofoil with the signs of the zodiac. And as usual, Nappi, I think, has the best rendition of the Hardy Boys and how they always have appeared in my mind's eye when I read the books. So it's also interesting that at this point in time, Nappi was usually having a sort of central focus from the actual plot on the cover, and then having either the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew sort of as either floating heads or almost interacting with a sort of physical rendition of elements of the actual plot, and also playing around with sort of having the image as part of the cover, either being surrounded by a background, as here we have with the very striking white, or being mixed in with a sort of sense of the abstract. I know this isn't everyone's favorite style of cover, but I think it really works well here, and especially because of the extreme difference between the red and the white, and also how the red seems like it's almost done sporadically, like either it's been ripped out of an image or that it's sort of splashed onto this white. So it's a really striking cover. I think it's easily the best of the three, but of course it's locked to the revised text, so you couldn't use this if you were reprinting the original text, as there was no hydrofoil in the original text. But ultimately, this cover does make it obvious that this new revised text was obviously done later, as it's got the style and hallmarks of Nappi's covers for the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew in the late 60s and early 70s. Now to talk about editions in my collection, I just have three. My copy of the original text that I've had for a while is part of the iconic brown tweed hardcovers. This is a 1950s copy. Of course, I don't have the original dust jacket, but this is what you come to expect from the books without the dust jackets, primarily in the 1950s with the iconic Hardy Boys logo. And as you can see, the reason why we call them the tweed hardcovers is because they have this sort of brown tweed pattern to the printing. Of course, here we have the spine, and the back is blank. This copy seems to be, of course, pre-1959, as it still has the original orange Greta end papers. Greta, of course, referring to the original artist. Here's, of course, the front piece artwork, the original 1941 copyright. Then, of course, the chapters that indicate the page count goes well over 200, and then the first page with the title, and, of course, the iconic font and layout of the original text. Now, I also have an original text edition with the original artwork, but this one is unique, as this is actually from Sampson and Lowe and a UK printing. Now, for those unaware, The British editions of the Hardy Boys, in terms of the original text, they were printed with entirely different methodologies. They were not done in the original release order. They frequently had completely different covers, or they mixed and matched elements, as they did somewhat on here. Now, while this uses the original cover art, you always have to keep in mind that they would, of course, mix and match different elements. So everything in terms of the British editions of Hardy Boys books is basically an entirely different world to the American ones. So you have to always keep in mind that the British editions, or collecting the British editions, is totally different. But here I just have a nice example of the original text, but you can see that already there are some other unique identifiers that start to creep in. So while we have a version of the original front piece, you can see the text and layout's a little bit different, and we have the credit for Sampson and Lowe of London. The copyright page is a little different, with, of course, notes about the UK printing. And, of course, the text and font and overall layout is also a little bit different. So these are always indicators that you've got a UK edition, because it's easy to miss if you're just looking at one of the UK editions that happens to have the same cover art as the American edition. There's also a little bit of page tanning or foxing, as you can tell, but it's just very uncommon to find a nice condition UK edition floating around, or be able to get one here in the US, as they don't really appear all that often. Another very unique element is that the British editions didn't necessarily have the same book hardcovers as the American editions did. So for quite a while, they actually did have the red boards that the books here in America had in the 1920s in terms of original text. So here they've sort of mixed different elements together of having a red book in terms of the actual hardcover boards, but having otherwise the design and title and logo of what we see on the 1950s Tweed editions. Here, everything's in black on red, and it's got a sort of a textured finish to it, if you can sort of tell that. And then a very similar spine. So these are very close to the American editions, but they have many weird and odd quirks of their own. So if you get into collecting the British editions, you basically have to start from scratch and relearn everything, because the whole printing methodology for the whole series was entirely different, and they didn't even print all of the revised text in the UK. Some of the original text stayed in print and never got the revision done, and then some did. So even the revised texts were done sort of all over the place in terms of the British market. And then on the back, there's a nice basic ad for the Lone Ranger series of books that I would like to read. Then for the revised text, I just have my flashlight copy that I grew up with. So this has the beautiful Rudy Nappy artwork. This is a good example of the flashlight getting it right in terms of not doing significant or major cropping of the image. So we have everything nicely preserved. The color and detail is well done, and the actual flashlight logo isn't too obtrusive. So this is really nicely done. We, of course, have the same matching spine as all the flashlights, and then the same generic rear cover that all the flashlights carry. Of course, we have the list of books at the front, the revised text descriptor, the front piece artwork, and title page. The updated copyright, meaning that this was printed in the year 2000, which puts it right there in the real sweet spot of getting really nice condition, well-made flashlight editions. As I've talked about in other videos, if you were to compare printings of the same book in these flashlight editions and put them side by side, you'll notice as time went on that they got less and less well constructed, and the covers wouldn't be as well produced. So really 1998 to 2000 to 2002 or so is really where you find it. I usually find the best examples. Once you get to copies that were made 2005 and later, that's when I think you can tell they're just not as well put together and manufactured or printed overall. And then, of course, we have the iconic font and layout of the revised text. And now I'll briefly go through the internal illustrations scenes that are iconic to the series, but of course only found in the revised text. It's one of the great comic moments from the opening where the boys get caught up in the protest about the hydrofoil, and Chet Morton quickly saves their bacon by painting a Frank Hardy for Mayor sign. Here the boys first observe the mysterious artist Henry Chasen, who seems to be everywhere that the case takes them. Here the boys and Chasen are in a death trap where they're trying to escape a locked area with an acetylene torch and, of course, burning up what little oxygen they have. And here is a great example in terms of the internal artwork, where you can definitely tell this is a revised text from 1970, as the art's more modern and the boys are usually drawn to look quite a bit older in this sort of era of the revised text. So even if you don't know the date of the revision in terms of when it was done, you can usually tell quite clearly by the internal artwork in terms of was it done in the 50s, 60s, or 70s. Here's a nice depiction of one of the boys' stakeouts at the marina, which goes horribly wrong when their listening device is, of course, tuned to a loud duck in the middle of the night. And then here Joe rescues Frank from being chopped to death by a giant blade in a prison workshop. So those are my thoughts on Book 20 and the original Hardy Boys series, The Mystery of the Flying Express. As I've said, I think the revised text is clearly a better written book and a more enjoyable experience than the original text, which suffers from a number of the same issues you find throughout the so-called John Button era of the books in terms of the ghostwriter. I think you can also tell very clearly that the revised text is from later on in the sort of text revisions, and while you might not be able to specifically pinpoint the year, the overall writing style, artwork, and cover art design very much indicate that it is from around that time period, as it feels very much like other books in the series done around the same time, which of course would be books like Danger on Vampire Trail, for example, which is book 50. So it is a bit jarring if you read the books in number order, as the styles do change from book to book in the revised text as they jumped around and did the revisions out of order. But in comparing the two, I do think the revised text does lose out on some of that wild pulpiness that you have in all of the original text, but especially the extreme wildness and out there factors of the John Button era books, which is really their strongest element, as otherwise they do come up short in pretty much every other area, and plot logic most of all. So while I do think the original text of Flying Express is thankfully not as crazy as The Disappearing Floor was in its original text version, you kind of miss some of that additional craziness because you get a little bit of it, but then the rest of the original text is a lot of backtracking and stuff that feels more like side quests, and it's a plot that never fully engages the reader outside of the dramatic moments and the set pieces and the overall concept of the boys trying to find a secret spy camp in the middle of the country in 1941. So for me, I think the revised text is a significantly better book, but I do wish it retained some more of the wildness of the original text, as the revised text is one of the books in the series that I've always felt was really solid and well done, but it wasn't necessarily one that had a plot that I felt was as memorable as some of the best in the series. So it's sort of a really well done book that might be considered somewhere more towards the middle if you were doing a series ranking of the revised text. And I think it was wise that they did leave a lot of the original text plot out of this revision. I mean, basically, this is one of the books that you could very much say is a completely different book. There are some core elements that are still there, but those are very, very hard links to make outside of there being some sort of vessel or mode of transportation called the Flying Express and there being some gang involved that the Hardy Boys are trying to find. So I do think the original text has its moments and it certainly has its fans, but I think it would be very difficult for someone to say that it is better than the revised text, as the revised text is so much stronger in terms of plotting, character, the actual mystery, the overall conclusion, and the reading experience in general. So I do think the revised text is the better of the two, but the original text is part of the John Bunton era of the series where things in the original text definitely went off the rails, since we're talking about trains, so to make a bad train pun. But anyway, it's an interesting experience to read these two back to back, and I would encourage all fans of the series to do a sort of comparison reread with Flying Express to see if reading them back to back might give you any new insights to the books. And it does create for a fresh reading experience. If you're like me and you've read the books many times and you're looking for a way to re-engage with them and look at them from a different perspective, there's no better way to do that than doing a comparison back to back of the original text and the revised text. So as always, I hope my babblings about the classic Hardy Boys series and book editions and collecting and comparing the texts has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I should hopefully be back soon with my next video in this series comparing the texts of book 21 in the series, The Clue of the Broken Blade. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some beautiful Hardy Boys editions for your own collection. Keep enjoying the wonderful magic of the Hardy Boys series. Keep reading print books, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching.